Senator Chris Murphy is certainly one of the best communicators we have in the Democratic Party. And it's not just because of his excellent presence on social media, the realness and authenticity he delivers with his resistance to Donald Trump. It's because of his willingness to be everywhere all the time. Chris Murphy has been doing nothing but podcasts, YouTube interviews, Instagram lives all the time since Donald Trump was inaugurated. And it's not just in liberal media spaces. He's also going on channels of the right and pushing back with that same fervor. And we saw an example of that when he went on conservative radio host Hugh Hewitt's show and completely shut him down, really silencing him in a perfect takedown, calling out the MAGA budget and Donald Trump's disastrous plans. We're going to get into it all, but before we do, if I could quickly ask you to leave a like on this video, and if you haven't already and you enjoy our channel, to hit that subscribe button. It goes a long way, and it really does mean a lot to me. Now let's check out this takedown from Senator Murphy.
What'd you make of the House budget that passed last night?
Yeah, I think it'll represent the most massive transfer of wealth and resources from the middle class and the poor to the wealthy, perhaps in the history of the country. 8 years ago, when they did the big tax cut, for most of that money went to the very wealthy and the corporations. It was all borrowed, right? So we just racked up in the end at least $2 trillion on our credit card. The economy didn't grow like they promised, and so it just got added onto the national debt. This time around, the debt will grow because $3 trillion of this is going to be borrowed, but over $1 trillion will come from cuts to programs that do matter to regular people. 24% of Americans are insured by Medicaid, working Americans, kids. That's how we pay for 2/3 of the nursing home beds in this country. And they're going to do $880 billion, somewhere around that, of cuts to Medicaid. There's no way for that to happen without a lot of people losing their insurance in a lot of red states. Hospitals closing, addiction treatment centers closing, and I just don't know why that's worth it if the bulk of the savings is going to go to people who are already very, very wealthy. I know they're going to have some tax cuts in here that will, help middle class folks, but the lion's share of the benefit will go to the very, very wealthy, financed by Medicaid cuts, which I just think is not what people thought was going to happen when they elected Donald Trump. I don't remember him promising to gut the Medicaid program, and I think people are going to be in for a pretty rude awakening when their rural hospital closes and they didn't get a tax cut that was anywhere close to the size of the tax cut that the CEOs got.
So, Senator, the American Rescue Plan of 2021, which passed via reconciliation, ran a deficit of $1.9 trillion. The second big Biden swing, the Inflation Reduction Act, cost $1 trillion over 10 years, $2 to $4 trillion over 25 years. So it looks to me like the House budget, I'm not sure it's the final, but the House budget actually uses deficit spending less than the two budgets that the Democrats passed when they had the reconciliation process. Why is that not apples to apples?
Well, for a very important reason. You're conflating two bills that are not similar. So the Inflation Reduction Act was fully paid for. It, in fact, reduced the deficit. You are right that the stimulus bill, the first bill, that was passed on the heels of other deficit-funded COVID relief bills, was deficit financed, just like all the COVID relief bills that Donald Trump passed were deficit financed. But after that first COVID relief bill that Biden passed, that next big swing, the Inflation Reduction Act, included, whether people like it or not, offsets, reductions in spending under Medicare, increases in personal and corporate tax liability that more than offset the payments. So, yeah, it's just not apples to apples because the Inflation Reduction Act was offset, was paid for, and actually reduced the deficit.
Okay, it's an interview, not a debate, but I'll send the audience. They can go look up the Inflation Reduction cost, the Inflation Reduction Act cost. Couple of questions. Do you want to tax?
You're right about the cost. I mean, the cost is high. The cost is high, but there's two. Those are two different conversations. The cost is big. The question is what the impact on the deficit is, and the cost it can be big, but as long as you have offsets, meaning either corresponding spending cuts or tax increases, the impact on the deficit is different than the overall.
And my research, and I can be wrong, frequently wrong, never in doubt on the radio and the television. My research said that the Inflation Reduction Act resulted in a deficit of $1 trillion over 10 years and 2 to 4 trillion over 25. But let's leave it to the audience to find out. I want to ask it, do you want to tax overtime, Senator?
Oh, listen, I'm willing to do anything that is, good for working people out there, whether it's reducing tax liability for overtime or their underlying wages. Ultimately, though, if you're working overtime and you pay a little bit less in taxes, but you lose your health insurance, that's not a good trade. And that's the trade that the Republicans are asking for. In many of these red states, they have Medicaid expansion programs that disappear, literally just disappear the minute that the match falls below 90%. There's no way to get $880 billion of Medicaid cuts without that match falling below 90%. So, ultimately, every family has a budget. And if they pay a little bit less in taxes on a handful of overtime hours, but they lose their health care, that's not a trade that they want.
Okay, the House budget also would eliminate the tax on tips. Do you want to tax tips?
That's a little bit more complicated question, right? There are a lot of people in this country that make their wages based on tips. And the question is, do you want an economy in which, folks don't pay taxes on tips, but pay taxes on salary or hourly income? Does that mean that ultimately a lot of work sort of gets shifted away from regular wages and into tips? I'm up for the conversation on how to do it, but I don't think that that's an easy one. There are going to be a lot of people in my state who will say, well, wait a second, I don't make my money on tips. I just go to work every day and, get paid $15 an hour. I got to pay, full taxes on that, but somebody that makes the majority of their wages in tips pays less taxes. That doesn't sound fair to me. So I'm up for the conversation. That one is just a lot more complicated when it comes to creating a fair tax structure.
But the House budget does both eliminate taxes on tips and taxes on overtime. You don't like the budget. I wonder if you want to keep those provisions or jettison them.
Well, just to be clear, it doesn't do either of those things. I mean, there's this claim that the House budget reduces or eliminates taxes on overtime and taxes on tips. It absolutely doesn't. Like, there's nothing in that budget document that they passed last night that says anything about eliminating taxes on overtime or taxes on tips. So, they may want to do that in the future, but that's actually nowhere in the budget they passed last night.
You can see Hugh Hewitt's reaction when Murphy checks him on the no tax on tips. That is missing very clearly from this proposed GOP budget. And even if they were to include it, Murphy goes on to make this argument that, sure, it's a good policy. In theory, on principle, he would support it, a tax reduction for working Americans who have a big portion of their income tied up in their tips. But if the deal that you're making to pay for it is the elimination of Medicaid, the closing down of rural hospitals, kicking people out of nursing homes, I don't think that's the trade we want. I don't think any American wants to make that trade. But Republicans don't really seem to care. It's all in the name of paying for a $5 trillion tax cut for billionaires like Elon Musk and Donald Trump. So who cares about the people they're screwing over? And that's pretty much their position on this. And it has been for everything, not just the budget, but Elon's cuts at Doge as well. And Senator Murphy went into that more in this clip right here.
Amid all the arbitrary cuts and refusal to pay out contracts Elon Musk has bragged about, said that he has done, just to be clear, you might notice that none of those contracts, and we've tried to see, are any of those contracts that he's deleting, that he's canceling, are the contracts the federal government has with Elon Musk's own companies, valued over the years at up to $38 billion. Well, the answer is no. He hasn't canceled any of those. And now the Washington Post is reporting that the Federal Aviation Administration is close to canceling its $2.4 billion contract with Verizon and awarding the work to Musk's Starlink company. In other words, breaking an existing contract worth billions with an American telecom company for some of the most vital systems in American aviation safety, yanking it away in favor of the company run by the guy doing all the cuts and overseeing the contracts? It's both deadly serious and cartoonishly corrupt. Joining me now is a lawmaker who's been outspoken against all the claims of cutting waste, Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat of Connecticut. I mean, every day, Senator, I find something where I'm like, this sort of tops what I had yesterday. The history of American corruption and most corruption is the history of people giving themselves government contracts. and here it appears to be just being done right in front of everyone's faces.
Yeah, the history of American corruption is that it happens behind closed doors and somebody discovers it. And the theory of the case here seems to be that if you are shameless about it, if you just do the corruption out in the open, that it legitimizes, normalizes it, and okays it. That is not true. That is not the case. What's happening at the FAA is a fundamental corruption, as you pointed out. Starling didn't win the initial contract. Either they lost the contract because they weren't qualified or they didn't even make a bid. And the contract has been awarded. It's Verizon has spent a ton of money putting this system into place, and Starlink is just going to usurp the contract because Elon Musk can, and because the whole point of this enterprise is to make Elon Musk even richer. But, you know, this is a pretty important contract. This is the FAA at a moment when planes seem to be, you know, falling out of the sky a little bit, and the idea that we're not going to have merit, for instance, have anything to do with the most critical systems that ensure the safety of people that fly, that is absolutely that's really scary. And so it's both corrupt and it's really dangerous. And I'm not sure that the American public are going to care that it's being done out in the open. They're going to still think that this is pretty miserable.
I recently saw a really great response from AOC. I'm going to track it down so we can watch it together. But she was asked about how a lot of people do like the idea of Donald Trump going in and you know, quote unquote, shaking things up in government and breaking things because they think government is broken. And AOC takes a second to respond. Clearly someone who has challenged the status quo before and done a great job doing so. And in her response is, yes, we want that, but why at the FAA? Why at USAID? Why in important entitlements like Social Security and Medicaid? Why in our prevention of disease? Why in cancer research? Why does that need to get shaken up? It doesn't. These aren't people trying to shake things up. These are people who don't know what they're doing and who are doing it in a dangerous way. And that's what we have to call out. And we are going to every single day, as you know, on this show. And if you want to support that, as always, you can hit that subscribe button. You can leave a like on this video. And if you stuck around to the end, you can drop a blue heart in the comments. And until next time, I'll see you soon.